Kennedys specifically? Was Bobby because of the...
It was primarily with Bobby, and that started in law school, and then it went over when I was in practice. He called on me to take part in the getting back the Bay of Pigs prisoners, which ended up my going to Cuba and negotiating with Castro, going out to Hemingway's house and so forth. So I had a pretty close relationship with Bobby.
1961, Fidel Castro was now in his third year as Cuba's absolute ruler. And as he turned his nation toward communism in the Soviet Union, he was becoming a villain in Washington.
Few in the president's inner circle saw it coming. 90 days into the term, they were all still filled with the euphoria of simply making it to the White House. Dangerous because it can result in poor judgment. In Kennedy's case, it did. He'd been presented with a plan targeting Fidel Castro and Cuba, a plan that had seemed so plausible. The chiefs told him in late February 1961 that they had been gearing up the U.S. military for months.
They'll have an amphibious landing on the beach, and then tomorrow they have a strike exercise, carrier strike exercise, and then they will be taken down to run to Panama. How many countries are represented? All but Cuba.
But direct American intervention was intended as the last resort. This was supposed to be disgruntled Cubans overthrowing a communist dictator. It had been hatched by the CIA and endorsed by President Eisenhower in his last months in office. A covert operation that would remove Castro, restore American influence over the Caribbean, and project Kennedy as a man of action and accomplishment. On April 15th, 8 B-26s, flying from a CIA-controlled airstrip in Nicaragua, bombed 3 Cuban airfields. But the surprise attack was no surprise at all to Castro.
A small exile force was quickly pinned down on the beach by the withering fire of the defenders, and the Cubans still had the planes to sink 3 of the incoming ships. Throughout the battle, Fidel Castro was everywhere in complete control, giving orders. By 5:30 in the afternoon of April 18th, it was all over. 1,200 invaders were captured. They would later be traded for American medicines and food. 114 men had died.
The Kennedys really wanted to get those prisoners back because they felt very responsible for their being there. And they wanted to get them back by Christmas, and this was already early December. We only had, I don't know, maybe a week to go, something like that. And so a group of us, private attorneys, worked out of the Justice Department while Jim Donovan up in New York and John Nolan were actually dealing with Castro on the deal itself. We were getting a ship and planes and railroads and all the rest of it to get supplies into Florida where we could put it on the ship. And it was important that the Kennedys be able to say this is not a government operation, because that would have upped the ante tremendously. This is a private endeavor. Well, of course, you know, it wasn't. I mean, we were all doing it right out of the Justice Department, but still. So I was in charge of transportation, of getting these planes and the boat and so forth, and then went to Florida, and we were loading this boat, and Castro got word that something was wrong. He was going to get a lot of junk and was going to be embarrassed. So he sent a couple of emissaries over, agents over in the middle of the night to see what was going on. And I only had about an hour's notice, so we repacked the ship and put all the good stuff on top. And they got there and looked things over, and then they went to my room at the Howard Johnson's and called Castro and told him that it was okay. There was some junk, but they were telling us to leave it all behind. So they would go around the dock and say, take this, leave this, don't want this, want this, and so forth. And then flew back to Cuba. And of course, by the next morning, it was absolute chaos. Nobody knew what the hell was going and what was staying behind, and we had to get the ship out of there. And so I finally just said, load everything. We'll worry about it later. Mm-hmm. So we loaded everything on the ship, and I went to a phone booth and called Bobby, and I said, we have a little problem. I told him, in his typical fashion, he said, well, Barrett, I guess you just have to go down and explain to Fidel why he's getting all that junk. And the next thing I know, I'm on a plane for Cuba. At the airport to meet me, and we had this conversation. I did not tell him. The ship was on its way. I figured I'd better wait for an opportune time. And just making conversation with one of his men, military men, I said, by the way, where's Hemingway's house from here? He said, well, it's up here in the hills. And he disappeared. He came back. He said, Fidel wants to take you. So we climb into these cars, you know, Tommy guns all over the place, and off into the hills we go. And we get to Hemingway's house, and it's locked. They rush around the neighborhood trying to find somebody who's got a key, and Fidel is getting pretty upset. And they finally found a manservant of Hemingway's who'd been with him about 20 years, and who had a key. And he not only let us in, but took us in, and then showed us the whole house. And the house was just exactly the way Hemingway left it before he went. Half a bottle of booze, and the weights on the wall in the bathroom, and all this kind of stuff. Slats under the bed. He showed us everything. Stayed there for the afternoon, sitting around the kitchen where the TV set was, where Hemingway used to watch the fights. And Castro, now speaking English, extending his relationship with Hemingway. Turns out, I learned later, they only met once, but he made it sound as if they'd done quite a bit together. But in any event, finally, we got up and went down. We stopped once so some people could applaud Castro, and went down to the wharf, and the ship was there, and they had begun unloading, and the thing that they had unloaded was baby food, and it was to the sky. Incredible amount of baby, and Castro was ecstatic. And he ordered that the prisoners could start going out the next morning. And that's when I told him that he was also getting a lot of junk that he didn't want, and I tried to explain why, but he really wasn't interested at that point. I mean, he could see that he was getting the stuff that was going to be good. And he got a lot of pharmaceutical stuff and drugs and things. So I spent kind of a drunken night there at the Hilton, and next morning flew out with a plane load of prisoners, and really one of the most extraordinary events of my life, because those prisoners were absolutely silent sitting down there on the runway. And MiGs would land, so we couldn't take off, and the motor was going. It was one of those prop jobs, and motors were going, and we couldn't take off. We couldn't take off. It was dead silence. And then finally, we went down the runway, and as the wheels lifted off, it was absolute pandemonium.
Wow.
Cigars came out of nowhere. They were screaming and yelling and crying, and people were kissing me, hugging me. The whole trip back was amazing. Got back Christmas Eve. He was a very interesting fellow. I mean, the fact that he's outlived, what, how many presidents now, 7 or 8 or whatever, and still in power. He was a presence. He was not as scruffy as I had anticipated. He was tired. He was exhausted when I saw him. But he was very much an in-charge kind of guy. There were so many guns around that I was frankly thinking that he was not long for this world. It looked like somebody was going to knock him off. And of course, here he still is, how many years later, you know. He was intelligent. I would not say brilliant, but he was very intelligent. The language barrier, even though he spoke English, it was kind of a broken English, and therefore that's always a problem, and particularly when you're being interpreted before he was talking English, it's a problem to gauge somebody accurately. But I must say I was pretty impressed with